So can I just ask, who finds the book of Revelation an easy read? Not even Anthony has put his hand up. Sorry? Well, I think Richard did a fantastic job of doing the reading, didn't he? So it's one of those books. I mean, the Gospels have got layers, haven't they? But you kind of, when you read the Gospels, you think, I understand Jesus went from there to there, and there was a person with this illness, or this was happening, and this. You can kind of follow what's going on. The book of Revelation feels like it's just on another, in another dimension. Of course, it is. It's talking about the throne room of God. It's talking about the heavenly places. It's talking about the book of Revelation. What does revelation mean? It means it reveals things that are not seen. It's hard to understand. And it's a book that you can read at lots of different levels. Now, I've been given 15 minutes maximum, okay? So when Paul starts twitching and looking at the clock, I'll know that it's time to wind up. And we can't begin to do justice to the layers that there are in these passages from Revelation in such a short time. So there are some things we want to notice, there are some things we want to know, and I would suggest there are some things that we're encouraged to be. And I'm going to use these two passages from Revelation and hook back a little bit earlier into Revelation and give us maybe a little bit of an overview of the end time and how that begins to flow back into our time and what we're being shown in this extraordinary book. I think a lecturer at college once described Revelation as Daniel on speed, so there you go. That's how comprehensible it is. So what are we noticing? Well, the reason I asked that question about heaven, what does this tell us about heaven, is we have this kind of idealistic notion of heaven, don't we, that is fed by the Hollywood machine, where with a, staircase to heaven, we could all come up with images of being rescued. It just feels like, it's not going to be like this one day. We're going to get to heaven, and we talk about that. Now, I'm not commenting here about that kind of intermediary state of going to heaven. In these chapters 21 and 22, we're looking at what happens at the end of time. And what happens at the end of time is the transformation of the world, not rescue from it. The transformation of the world, not rescue from it. Because what happens is heaven and earth fuse together. I see a new heaven and a new earth. And did you notice the sea will be no more? What's that about? Well, if you read earlier in Revelation chapters 17 and 18, I think, maybe 18 and 19, you'll hear about the beast from the sea. The sea, the beast from the sea, that's about idolatry, that's about us following our own self-gratification and destroying what's around us. That's extinguished with this fusing together of heaven and earth. The ultimate end is transformation, not rescue. The other thing that always strikes me about this passage is it's a new Jerusalem. It's a city. And we do that, don't we? We have those lovely... Anybody talks to you about Psalm 23, we're into pastures green, and we love it, and it's great. But in our heads, that's where we stay. That's the restful place. The city is the hard place, the place that's a bit dirty, that's a bit difficult, that we want to be rescued out of. Now, there are some people in this room who love the city. I can see Karen muttering over in the corner, I love the city. But we have this strange notion. But what comes down from heaven is a new city, the new Jerusalem. How extraordinary is that? And there's no need for a temple. Did you notice that? In heaven, there's a temple. God is worshipped in the temple. Back into chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation, which I'll talk about very briefly in a minute, we see the temple. But with this fusing of heaven and earth, there is no need for a temple. God is reigning among God's people. God doesn't have to be separate. God doesn't have to be hidden away in this temple. God is dwelling among mortals. if you read a bit further in these chapters, you will see that heaven and earth, this new heaven and new earth, is not for everyone. People make choices that take them out of this new world where God is reigning, where God is present with God's people. And then moving on to chapter 22, I'm, as some of you know, very fixated by Ezekiel 47, which is the river that Ezekiel cannot cross. The river of life, the river that flows from the throne of God. It's the same river in this chapter, Revelation 22. And where does it flow? It flows through the city. It's not flowing through lovely green pastures in some, idyllic place. It's flowing through an idyllic city, the New Jerusalem. And what's along its banks is the tree of life. And the leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations. The passion of the Creator God is for the flourishing of the world. We see it at the end of time. But as we read Revelation, not all of Revelation is about the end times. It's also about the now times. It's about what is happening in our world now, before the end. Chapters 3 and 4, if you go back and you read them later, what you'll find is the worship of God in the throne room. Something invisible that's happening while we're standing here now. The worship of God in heaven, the worship of God in an eternal and ethereal place. And something has happened in history. Something, we're coming up to Easter, we're going to celebrate in a fortnight's time. We're going to celebrate not only Jesus' life, which we celebrate throughout the year, we're going to celebrate Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection, and Jesus' ascension. An absolutely pivotal moment in history. Annie, pivot. Can you pivot for us and show us what pivoting does? What's happened? Change of direction. A change of direction. What happened at Easter? Tom Wright talks about Good Friday as the day the revolution began. The day the revolution began. A pivotal moment in history when all that had been turned. And because of Jesus' life and death and resurrection and ascension, somehow want those to be in a different order, and it doesn't work. You have to rise before you can ascend. It's just the way it is. Something happened. And what we're told in these chapters of Revelation is that what has happened is that life is awful. There are really destructive forces on the earth. There are terrible, terrible, terrible things happening. And yet, Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Even though we live in a world that is messed up, even though we live in you only have to switch the news on. In fact, you might even be hiding from the news at the moment and you probably still can't escape it. There are terrible things happening in our world. It's not new. Terrible things have been happening in the world for centuries. And throughout all the terrible things, Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Something happened on that pivotal moment in history that we're going to celebrate, we're going to mark in 2 weeks' time, when Jesus died and rose again and ascended to be with the Father. If you go into chapters 17 and 18 of the book of Revelation, you find this account of the beast from the sea. Remember, in this end time, there is no sea. The beast from the sea has nowhere to kind of splurge out from, as it were, and the dragon. You will read of Rome and of Babylon. And I don't have time to unpack what those are symbolising, what those are pulling forward for us. But the shorthand is that they are about idolatry. They are about turning away from worship of the living God and worshipping whatever gods we fancy, including ourselves. They are about economic exploitation. They are about using people for our own ends. They are about the abuse of power, of money, and of sex for self-gratification and the exploitation, the depravity, the oppression, the cruelty towards other people. And there's nothing biblical that says there is anything wrong with power, money, or sex. What's wrong is what you do with them. And when you use them to abuse other people, they distort and they corrupt what God has intended for good. Jesus, God's plan is set out 1 and 2 Genesis 1 and 2. Go back to it, look at it. What was God's plan? God's plan was that God created people so that they would rule the earth under God's authority. Why? So that the earth could flourish. Humans were intended to be standing between the creator and the created and managing it for its flourishing, for their flourishing, and for the worship of God. Jesus comes to bring transformation. We've made our confession. We've said we're sorry. We've asked God to turn us around, to pivot us, if you like, in our lives, this moment, this week, this day, wherever we are with that. And at the end of time, in the meantime, we've got Jesus the man. Remember Martin's Easter song? Jesus the man. Jesus the man who does stand between the creator and the created and brings all things through Jesus for the flourishing of people and for the earth. And at the end of time, when there is a new heaven and a new earth, we will be standing in a place where we are responsible, we are able to bring the flourishing of the world to fruition. Now, the story of the Bible and the account in Revelation shows us that this is not preserved as something that is only at the end of time. It is something that is rolled back into history. The kingdom of God. We pray every week when we say the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come. Bring your kingdom into this world, Lord. That's not going to fully happen until the end of time. But it is something that is real for us now as we open our lives to Jesus and inviting this new kingdom world into the present. While in the heavenlies all of that worshipping is going on in the throne room of God, we are part of what is going on there and opening those gates at the end of time for it all to roll back into now. It's our APCM day. We're going to be talking a bit later about what this church does. But what is it that the church's role is in all of this? Again, really top line stuff. The role of the church is to worship God and to model what human flourishing looks like, to reflect God's glory into the world, to worship the living God. No idolatry, no worship of self. When it's all about me, I've got something wrong. And it's for sure not about worshipping other gods or other things in our lives that we make into gods. It's about shaping some sort of communal life that models, that reflects out what it looks like to be a flourishing community and to reflect back to the world the glory of God. to mirror to the powers. Do you know, it doesn't have to be like that. And actually, the way that the abuse of power works is wrong. And we live in a community where it simply isn't like that. And look how good this is. That's the role of the church. It's not our role to isolate ourselves. It may be that as individuals we need to protect ourselves from some things or many things in the world. And it may be that as a community we need to protect vulnerable members of our community from some things in the world. As a community, if we isolate ourselves from the world, we collude with its abuse of power, of money, and of sex, and we allow it to become something that is only about its own self-gratification. Now, that's not to say that there are not lots of good people in the world, and that there are not lots and lots of people who have something of the image of God in them, and who would stand and also would criticise and would stand against these abuses. But it is the particular role of the church to hold a mirror up to the world and to say, life, God created us to live differently. As we come to our APCM, you might want to be thinking about, well, even as the questions we're going to ask now, maybe, I think. How at St. Germain's do we reflect God into the world? What is it we could do better, and how do we do that? Not quite 15 minutes, but I'm going to claim that as victory.